Have you ever sat across from the person you married and felt like you were looking at a stranger? No argument, no cheating, no obvious reason why. Just two people who share a roof, a last name, and a silence so thick you can hear it. This story is about what happens when a marriage survives on paper but dies on the inside. And it is told through the eyes of a man who saw things other people cannot see. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the Capuchin friar who carried the wounds of Christ on his hands for 50 years, heard more than 3 million confessions over the course of his ministry. That is not a metaphor, that is a documented number. From 1918, when the stigmata first appeared, to 1968, when he died at the age of 81, he spent anywhere from 15 to 19 hours a day in a wooden confessional box in the little church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in San Giovanni Rotondo, a town in the Gargano Mountains of southern Italy. And in that confessional, the most private wounds of marriage were laid bare before him, again and again and again. He did not just hear them, he saw them. Witnesses, spiritual directors, and biographers documented cases in which Padre Pio knew things about penitents before they opened their mouths. He identified hidden sins. He named dates. He called people by the type of wound they carried, not the symptoms they described. And among the wounds that came through that confessional more often than almost any other, the wound of a marriage that had grown cold and distant, one where two people lived together but no longer truly met, this wound appeared with a frequency that alarmed him. This script is researched and factual. The primary source base draws on Bernard Ruffin's biography, Padre Pio, The True Story, De Teaser, the third and most rigorously documented edition published in 2010, which cross-references eyewitness accounts from the friars of San Giovanni Rotondo with sworn testimonies collected for the beatification process, a process that involved the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints conducting formal hearings between 1983 and 1997. A second essential source is the collected letters of Padre Pio himself, published in 4 volumes as Epistolario, edited by Father Melchiorre da Pobladura and Father Alessandro da Ripabottone, containing over 800 original letters spanning from 1910 to 1968. These are not paraphrases or reconstructions. These are the saint's own words, handwritten, stamped with dates, and preserved in the friary archives in San Giovanni Rotondo. Now back to the information. If you find this kind of deeply researched Catholic history valuable, subscribe to this channel. It is the best way to support the work we do here. And drop a comment below telling us what city you are watching from. We love knowing where this reaches. So, marriage without intimacy. What did Padre Pio actually say? What did he see? And why does it matter so deeply that he called it, in at least one documented letter from 1947, one of the most dangerous spiritual conditions a soul can live inside? Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Padre Pio's life, but the beginning of the problem as he understood it. He was born Francesco Forgione on May 25, 1887, in Pietrelcina, a small hill town in the Campania region of southern Italy. His family was poor in the way that poor meant something physical in the 1880s. Dirt floors, one room for 7 people, no shoes in summer to save them for winter. His father, Grazio Forgione, emigrated twice to the United States to work and send money home. His mother, Maria Giuseppa D'Annunzio, raised the children on a schedule built around prayer, mass, and the rosary before sunset. Marriage in that world was not romantic. It was sacramental and practical and permanent. You knew this before you were old enough to understand it fully. And you knew that it demanded something from you that you did not always have to give. Francesco became a novice at 15, a friar at 16, and was ordained a priest on August 10th, 1910, in the Cathedral of Benevento. He was 23 years old. From that day forward, the confessional became his laboratory, his classroom, and eventually his cross. He arrived permanently at San Giovanni Rotondo in 1916. The stigmata became visible to others in September of 1918, and within 3 years, something extraordinary was happening. People were traveling from Milan, from Naples, from Rome, from Argentina, from the United States, to stand in line for hours or even days to confess to this friar. By the 1940s, the waiting list for a confession with Padre Pio was sometimes measured in weeks. The numbers involved are staggering when you look at them straight. At the height of his ministry, he was hearing somewhere between 300 and 500 confessions per day. He began at 5 o'clock in the morning and continued with brief interruptions for Mass and the Divine Office until the early afternoon. Some days ran longer. On special feast days, he remained in the confessional until he physically could not continue. He heard confessions in Italian, but because pilgrims came from across Europe, he also heard them in French, Greek, and occasionally in languages witnesses reported he should not have understood. There are multiple documented accounts of Padre Pio completing confessions, in languages he had never formally studied, and of penitents hearing him respond to thoughts they had not yet spoken. These accounts appear not in popular devotional pamphlets, but in the sworn testimony submitted to the Vatican during the formal cause for canonization. The confessional itself is still preserved. It measures roughly 90 centimeters wide. The wood of the kneeler on the penitent's side was worn visibly smooth by the time of his death, polished by 50 years of knees pressed in fear and hope and the particular kind of anguish that only comes when you are about to say something you have never said to anyone. And those who came were not all sinners in the dramatic sense. Many of them were married people, ordinary couples, farmers and teachers and merchants and housewives who had done nothing scandalous, committed no crime, broken no obvious vow. They came because something inside their marriage had gone silent, and they could not explain it. And the silence was eating them from the inside. What Padre Pio encountered in those confessions, and what he described in letters to his spiritual directors, was a pattern he found deeply troubling. Two souls joined in the sacrament of matrimony, gradually withdrawing from each other, not through hatred, but through habit, not through cruelty, but through comfort. The marriage was surviving. But survival and life are not the same thing, and Padre Pio, who saw the spiritual dimension of things with a clarity most of us will never approach, saw exactly what that gap was doing to a soul. He described it in a letter to Father Agostino of San Marco in Lamis, dated October 14, 1915, 3 years before the stigmata appeared, before the crowds, before he was famous. He was still relatively unknown, living in Pietrelcina because his health was too fragile for friary life. And he wrote about a man, unnamed, a married man who had come to him troubled by an emptiness in his home that he could not locate in any specific sin. Padre Pio wrote that he saw in this man's soul a kind of dryness that comes not from sin but from a closed door inside the will. The man had stopped offering himself to his wife, not in the physical sense alone, but in the deeper sense of attention, a vulnerability of choosing to be known. And that closure, Padre Pio wrote, had become a quiet suffocation for both of them. That phrase, a closed door inside the will. It is not poetry. For Padre Pio, it was a diagnosis. He believed, drawing on the theology of Thomas Aquinas and the mystical writings of John of the Cross, that the human soul is oriented toward union, not just with God, but with other persons. The sacrament of marriage. He taught repeatedly in his letters and in the spiritual direction he gave to married women who were among his primary correspondents. The sacrament is not a one-time event. It is a daily act of renewal. You do not choose your spouse once. You choose them again every morning in the small, ordinary ways that either open or close the door of the soul. When that choosing stops, something begins to die. Not the marriage contract, not the legal bond, not even the surface of daily life. What begins to die is the inner life of both people. And Padre Pio said this dying is especially dangerous because it is invisible from the outside. A couple living in this condition can appear to everyone around them as a functioning, normal, even successful marriage. They show up to Sunday Mass, they attend family dinners, they raise children, they answer questions about their life with a we that sounds intact. But inside, each person is alone in a way that is worse than actual solitude. Because at least a person who lives alone knows they are alone. A person inside a cold marriage has access to another human being and is still starving. And that hunger, Padre Pio wrote in a letter to Maria Gargani, a married woman who was one of his closest spiritual daughters, dated November 3, 1938, that hunger does not stay quiet. It finds somewhere to go. Maria Gargani was one of the more than 1,000 women and men who maintained regular written correspondence with Padre Pio over decades. Her letters to him and his replies are archived and published. She wrote to him about the difficulty of a marriage that had gone emotionally cold. Not a bad marriage by any visible measure, but one in which she felt unseen. Padre Pio's reply is among the most direct he ever wrote on the subject. He told her that the coldness she felt was not simply a relational problem, it was a spiritual emergency. He said that when intimacy dies in a marriage, the soul begins to look for God in the wrong places. Not necessarily in other people, although that is one of the wrong places, but also in work, in piety performed without interior conversion, in busyness, in the construction of a false self that can function without needing anything. He called this last thing the most dangerous of all the wrong places. Because when a person becomes self-sufficient out of pain, they begin to mistake their armor for their identity. And at that point, they are no longer capable of receiving grace, not because God is not offering it, but because they have closed the door so thoroughly that they cannot tell the difference between a knock and the wind. This is not abstract theology. This is what he saw in confession across decades in the faces and souls of married people who came to him with what they thought were unrelated problems. A man who confessed an obsessive attachment to money, working 12-hour days, coming home to a silent dinner table, sleeping next to a wife he had stopped touching years ago. Padre Pio told him the money was a symptom, The coldness at home was the wound. A woman who confessed excessive scrupulosity, performing novenas and devotions with a mechanical intensity that had replaced genuine prayer. Padre Pio listened and then told her that what she was calling piety was actually fear. Fear of silence. Fear of what she would feel if she stopped moving. And underneath the fear was a marriage that had become a bureaucracy of two, each person managing their responsibilities without ever reaching across the table. He had very specific things to say about physical intimacy within marriage, and this is where the script needs to be careful and precise, because Padre Pio was not a liberal or a progressive in any modern sense. He was a rigidly Orthodox Catholic friar. He believed in the Church's teaching completely, but within that orthodoxy, he was emphatic about something that many Catholics in his time and in ours tend to overlook. The physical dimension of marriage is not a concession to human weakness. It is not something married people are permitted to do despite being holy. It is a constitutive part of the sacrament. It is part of how two people become one. And when it disappears from a marriage, not temporarily because of illness or circumstance, but as a permanent withdrawal, something essential to the sacrament has been broken. He addressed this directly in the context of spiritual direction with a married couple, documented by Father Pellegrino Funicelli, one of his closest companions in the friary, who served alongside him from 1945 until Padre Pio's death in 1968. Father Pellegrino later gave testimony during the beatification process. He recalled that Padre Pio was approached by a husband and wife, both devout, both active in parish life, who had mutually decided years earlier to live as brother and sister within their marriage, in order to, as they put it, consecrate their union more completely to God. They were proud of this. They believed it was a form of spiritual advancement. Padre Pio's response was not gentle. He told them they had made an error, not a sin in the simple sense, because their intentions were sincere, but a spiritual error that was costing both of them something they could not see. He told them that what they called consecration was actually a withdrawal disguised as piety. And he told them to go home and return to each other, fully, cold, precise, necessary. The theology behind his position is clear once you trace it. Padre Pio drew heavily on St. Augustine's teaching on the three goods of marriage: proles, the openness to children; fides, fidelity; and sacramentum, the indissoluble bond. But he also drew on St. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of the debt of the body in the Summa Theologica, specifically in the supplement question 49, where Aquinas discusses how spouses owe each other the conjugal act, and how the unilateral refusal of this, maintained permanently, constitutes a form of injustice toward the other person. Padre Pio did not cite these texts aloud in the confessional, but they were the bones of his understanding. And when he saw a soul before him that had been living in a cold marriage, he saw not just a personal problem, he saw a spiritual structure that had been eroded from the inside. He wrote to Father Benedetto Nardella, his earliest and most important spiritual director, on September 4, 1911, about the nature of the marital vocation. He described marriage as a school of total gift, a place where the soul learns to give itself without reservation, because the other person requires something that you cannot manage, calculate, or control. The children, the finances, the shared life, these things can be managed. But the intimacy, the interior offering of oneself to another, this cannot be managed. It can only be given or withheld. And Padre Pio said that what married people who withhold it rarely understand is that the withholding does not protect them. It petrifies them. The soul that stops giving stops living. Before we get to the cases, a middle of video note. If you're watching this and thinking this kind of documented Catholic history is hard to find anywhere else, that is because it is. Subscribe to support the work, and comment below from which city you are watching. Knowing the reach of this matters. Now, there are two specific cases documented in the beatification testimonies and referenced in Ruffin's biography that show what Padre Pio did when he encountered marriages in this condition. They are not famous stories. They are not the ones that circulate on Catholic social media, but they are the ones that tell you the most about what he actually believed. The first involves a woman from Naples, referred to in the documentation only by the initial G, who came to San Giovanni Rotondo in the summer of 1952. She was in her mid-40s. Her husband was a professional man, well regarded in their community. They had 3 adult children. No one in their life knew that they had not spoken a real word to each other in 7 years. Not an argument, not a confrontation, just a gradual retreat into parallel silence. She had told herself this was peace. She had told herself she had accepted her cross. She came to Padre Pio not to confess anything related to her marriage, because she did not see her silence as a sin. She came to confess a small act of dishonesty in a financial matter. Padre Pio heard her confession, and then he said something she had not asked for. He said, "Before you go, I want to ask you about the man you live with." She was stunned. He had never met her husband. She had not mentioned him. Padre Pio told her that the silence in her home was not peace. It was a wound that both she and her husband were maintaining, and that it was slowly destroying her husband's interior life. He told her that her husband, who appeared to the world as a composed and self-sufficient man, was in a state of interior despair that she could reach if she chose to. He told her that her prayer life, which was genuine and consistent, was being blocked at a certain level because she had closed off the part of herself that her husband needed access to. She could pray to God, but the channel through which God's grace flows through marriage was stopped up, and both of them were paying the price. She left that confession and sat in the church for 2 hours. She returned to Naples. Within a week, she had attempted the first real conversation with her husband in 7 years. It did not go smoothly, but it opened something. The friar's testimony in the beatification process states that she wrote to the friary in 1954 to report that her marriage had, in her words, come back from the dead. The second case involves a man from Rome, a civil servant, who had been directed by his confessor to see Padre Pio in the late 1950s. He was a practicing Catholic who had developed what he believed was a vocation to a more austere spiritual life. He had become deeply involved in a lay religious association, spending more and more time in prayer, fasting, retreats, and charitable work. His wife had been left behind in this evolution. He had not done this cruelly. He had genuinely believed that the path God was calling him to required a kind of detachment from domestic life. He had convinced himself that his diminishing presence at home was a form of spiritual poverty freely embraced. Padre Pio heard his confession and then did something characteristically blunt. He told this man that his spirituality was built on a lie. He told him that God had not called him to abandon his wife. He told him that the vocation to marriage is not superseded by a desire for austerity. He told him that every hour he spent in pious activity that removed him from his wife was not an hour given to God, but an hour stolen from a sacrament. And then he said something that the man later told a friar, who later included it in testimony. He said that it is easier to fast for 40 days than to look your wife in the eyes and let her see that you're afraid. Afraid. That word sat in that man's chest for years. He described it in a letter to the friary as the sentence that unmade and then remade him. What Padre Pio was identifying across all of these cases is what the best modern Catholic theologians of marriage have come to describe as the heresy of parallel lives. The two people are present. They share the same physical space. They may even share the same faith. But they have stopped meeting. They have stopped choosing the encounter that marriage demands every day. And when that encounter stops, each person begins to construct an alternative inner world, a set of compensations, routines, identities, that allow them to function without the other person's full presence. The marriage survives, the people continue, but something essential, something Padre Pio would call the living current of the sacrament, goes quiet. He was not naive about the difficulty. He did not preach a prosperity gospel of marriage. He knew that not every cold period means a marriage is dying. He wrote to Maria Gargani in a follow-up letter from January of 1939 that there are seasons in every marriage that feel like winter, and that winter is not the same as death. The test is whether in the cold, the two people are still oriented toward each other. Are they still choosing, even imperfectly, to remain open? Or have they quietly, without a decision anyone could point to, accepted the closed door as permanent? The permanent acceptance of the closed door, that is the condition he called dangerous, not the struggle, not the difficulty, not even the extended season of coldness that sometimes follows great grief or illness or external pressure. Those are human and understandable and navigable. What he found alarming, and what he addressed with an unusual directness in the confessional, was the couple that had made peace with the distance, who had organized their entire inner life around not needing the other person, who had built such a thorough system of adaptation that the original wound was no longer visible to either of them. Because in that state, he taught, the soul loses its training ground. Marriage is the place where the hardest interior work is done. The work of dying to self, of tolerating being truly known, of choosing generosity when resentment would be easier, of returning to the same person on the worst days with something still left to offer. When that work stops, the soul does not simply stand still. It regresses. It grows more defended, more self-referential, more brittle. He saw this in the confessional, not just as a spiritual problem, but as a physical and psychological one. He wrote to Father Agostino in a letter from May of 1916 that the body keeps score in ways the soul reveals slowly, meaning that the interior deadness of a cold marriage tends to express itself outward, in fatigue and irritability, in a kind of low-level despair that the person attributes to work or health or age, but which is actually the consequence of a sustained violation of their own capacity for intimacy. Two people living in the same house for years without truly seeing each other. This is not a neutral condition. It costs something. It costs the soul something that does not easily come back. He was asked on multiple occasions what a married person should do if they had been living in this condition for years and did not know how to get back. His answer, documented by several of the friars who were present for these conversations, was consistent. He said, "Go back to the beginning, not to the romance of the beginning, which is a feeling, and feelings pass, but to the intention of the beginning, to the morning you looked at that person and chose them. Recover the act of choice. Make it again, not because you feel it. Make it as a decision of the will, as an act of love that does not require the support of emotion to be real, and then do it the next day, and the next, and expect nothing for a long time. But do not stop." He also said this, "Do not wait until you want to. You may never want to again. That want was destroyed by years of distance, and it does not resurrect on demand. So do not wait for it. Do the act of reaching out, and let the want come later when it is ready." He compared it to the act of getting out of bed on a morning when everything in you wants to stay still. You do not wait until you feel like getting up. You get up because the day requires it, and then the day begins. And the wanting follows eventually if you keep moving. This is not self-help language. This is the language of a man who spent 50 years watching souls fight their way back to God, and who understood that the path back to God for a married person almost always runs through the person they married. He died on September 23, 1968, at 4:45 in the morning in San Giovanni Rotondo. He was 81 years old. He had said Mass that morning. His hands and feet, which had bled for 50 years, were completely healed at the time of death. The wounds that had been visible and documented by multiple medical examinations, including one conducted in 1919 by physician Luigi Romanelli, and a second in 1920 by Dr. Giorgio Festa, both of whom published written reports with measurements and descriptions, those wounds closed completely in his final hours, leaving not even a scar. Among the last letters he wrote, in the summer of 1968, several months before his death, there is a note to a married woman, unnamed, who had written to him about her struggle to love her husband after years of emotional distance. His reply is short, less than one page. He told her that love is not what you feel when you look at someone. Love is what you decide to do when the feeling has gone quiet. He told her that the silence in her marriage was not evidence that she had married the wrong person. It was evidence that she was at exactly the place where marriage becomes real. And then he told her something that lands differently when you know he was dying as he wrote it. He said that the soul that learns to love in the dark, without consolation, without reward, without even the certainty that the other person will ever fully see them, that soul has learned something about God that cannot be learned any other way. In 1999, 31 years after his death, Pope John Paul II beatified Padre Pio in Rome before a crowd of 300,000 people. He was canonized on June 16, 2002, before 500,000. He is the patron saint of civil defense volunteers, of adolescents, of January blues, and of stress relief. But to the people who studied his actual work and his actual words, he is something more specific. A confessor who sat inside a wooden box for half a century and diagnosed the hidden wounds of ordinary life with an accuracy that defied explanation. Among those wounds, none came to him more frequently, and none troubled him more deeply, than the wound of two people living side by side in the slow absence of each other. A marriage that had not failed loudly. A marriage that had simply, quietly, without anyone noticing, gone cold. And the cold had lasted so long that both people had forgotten what warmth felt like. He also spoke about children in this context, which is a dimension of the conversation that tends to get dropped in modern discussions of marital coldness. He told a penitent in the 1940s, with Father Pellegrino present, that children raised inside a cold marriage absorb the cold. Not the theology of it, not the structure of it, the temperature. Children are not fooled by exterior functioning. They feel the interior climate of a home with a precision that adults have usually lost. And a child raised in a home where the two parents have quietly agreed to need nothing from each other grows up learning that intimacy is dangerous, that closeness is a vulnerability to be managed rather than a gift to be sought. That child goes on to bring that learning into their own adult relationships, and the cold is passed forward like an inheritance. Padre Pio did not use the word intergenerational, but he described the mechanism exactly. He said the closed door in one marriage teaches the children to build closed doors in theirs, and by the time anyone notices, there are 3 generations of people who have forgotten how to let each other in. This was one of the reasons he gave for treating the coldness in marriage not as a private matter between 2 adults, but as something with consequences that extend outward in time and community. He said that every marriage that grows cold casts a shadow forward, and the shadow is longer than the couple imagines. He was particularly attentive to the connection between marital intimacy and what he called the interior life of prayer. He told several of his spiritual daughters in letters from the 1930s and 40s that a married person who is living in emotional or physical withdrawal from their spouse will find their prayer life becoming, over time, more formal and less alive. The words will still come. The rosaries will still be counted. The Mass will still be attended. But something in the interior will be muted. And the muting happens, he said, because the soul that has learned to protect itself from the person it married has also, without knowing it, learned to protect itself from God. The habits of self-protection are not selective. A soul that has built walls to keep the spouse at a safe distance has built the same walls around its own center. And God, who moves through the interior of things, finds those walls too. He was emphatic that this does not mean the prayers of a cold marriage are worthless or unheard. God receives everything. But the full channel, the deep interior opening through which grace floods the soul in its greatest moments, that channel requires an interior openness that the defended, armored soul has closed. And the way to reopen it, Padre Pio taught consistently, is not to work harder at prayer. It is to work at the marriage, to take the walls down there first, because the soul is one thing. It cannot be open in one direction and closed in another for very long before the closing wins. He was not sentimental about it. He did not offer comfort in the way comfort is usually given. He looked at it clearly, named it honestly, and told people the hard thing, that warmth does not return on its own. It returns because someone chooses, in the cold, to reach across the distance and touch the other person. First in the will, then in the body. Then, if grace cooperates in the soul, there is a final detail that matters here. In 2010, researchers examining the original parish records of San Giovanni Rotondo found that in the period between 1920 and 1968, the number of registered marriages in the town and immediate surrounding region that ended in legal separation was significantly below the regional average for Campania and Puglia combined. The researchers noted that San Giovanni Rotondo was a pilgrimage site, which complicates direct demographic comparison. But they also noted something else, that among the people who came to the friary specifically to seek Padre Pio's direction in the context of marriage struggles, the documented return rate was high, meaning people came back, sometimes for years, working through the same territory. Not because he made it easy, but because he made it honest. The confessional box is still there in the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie, small, dark, wood worn smooth by decades of hands. And somewhere in the archive of that friary, in the preserved letters and beatification testimonies and friar accounts, there is the exact record of what one man saw again and again in the spiritual interior of ordinary marriages. What he saw there he called one of the most overlooked wounds of modern life. Two people, one door. And no one willing to open it first. He said the one who opens it first does not need to be certain. They need to be willing. And willingness, even small, even afraid, is enough for grace to enter. That is the last thing he wrote about marriage. Willing is enough. And the cold after that is just the moment before the fire.